it's not just available in West Auckland. We are, as Wallace was saying about talking to people and how they've coped with the virus, we've been very fortunate that we don't have a brick and mortar setup, so we don't have a specific location out in West Auckland. And we, I guess you could call us like a gypsy brewing company, if you like. So we're using different locations, different wineries, different breweries to make our product. So it's made us a lot easier to get through this COVID situation.
Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute, but Stephen, you would have obviously had some mead.
Well, Shakespeare drank mead, I believe, so, it obviously has good effects for you.
Okay.
I can remember certainly having it in the UK, and it's great we've got it here, because that adds to the range of great products.
I just want, in terms of one of the reasons why we do this, is to try and champion through this pretty difficult time, Adam, through this era of pandemic, small New Zealand-made businesses, small startups. How have you found it? How are you finding it?
Yeah, like I said, we were probably more on the fortunate side of small business that we didn't have a brick and mortar production area, so we're not paying the rent and the rates, which unfortunately has probably hurt people when they haven't been able to open their doors for customers. Whereas we've been able to continue to sell online. The pandemic has probably stifled production a little bit, where I haven't been able to get into the wineries and breweries as much as I would have liked during that time. But I guess in the whole grand scheme of things, we've been very lucky.
So to people who do want to try it, well, it's honeybandit.co.nz. I have been taking note of some of the things that you offer. Oaked Traditional, one of the first style of meads we created and a favourite of our mead maker, created with taupo kamahi honey and a blend of charred American oak. Very nice. You've also got cacao nibs and coffee beans. But in terms of a category, very new to New Zealand audiences. Do you think you've got a chance to actually get Kiwis to take up this mead habit?
Yeah, I'm hoping so. In the US currently, mead is the biggest alcohol growing segment. So they are kind of piggybacking on the craft beer revolution, and I'm hoping that we can do the same. So our range doesn't just include them 11% wine style meads. We have a 5% carbonated mead, which we hop. So you could think of that like a beer or a cider, perfect for cracking a can open on a nice, hot, sunny day.
Good on you, Adam. Well, go well with your business and all the very best to you. That is a yeast wrangler, Adam Reid, who is a mead maker. You got to take your hat off, don't you, Ella Henry, to these small entrepreneurs who try a product, get some money together, take a risk.
See an opportunity. That's the true entrepreneurial spirit at work. Prepared to back themselves, invest in themselves. We have to grow that small domestic market as much as we do the big corporate juggernauts, because that's what the majority of New Zealand businesses are.
Yeah. Do you think we can do a bit better? For us,
we've got to do a bit better, particularly because these people are putting their money on the line. We've got to find better ways of supporting them, financing them, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
All right, lovely to have you both on, Stephen Jacoby and Ella Henry. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Wallace.
For being with us. Hide it up. See you later, and see you tomorrow at 3:45. Till then, bye.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere nei, break out the bubbles. A quarantine-free Christmas on the Golden Sands of Bondi could be on the cards, according to the Aussie Tourism Minister. Who else is rolling out the welcome mat, and is it really, really going to happen? A spring snow flurry grounds flights and traps school holiday makers. Labour pledges to keep the lights on at TY Point sound familiar, while National and New Zealand First beat them to it. There's a new political poll too. 3 German yachties are in custody after breaking COVID rules and sailing into Northland without permission. Will others follow? And the Wallabies start training for real tomorrow if they're virus threat free after day 3 tests. The COVID kind, that is.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. New figures show Auckland's job losses have been far fewer than predicted, despite the city going into lockdown last month. The council forecast 250 jobs a day would go during level 3, but the latest job seeker figures show an average of 93 people a day have gone on the benefit in Auckland since August the 7th, days before level 3 was reimposed. Westpac Chief Economist Dominic Stevens says the cost of lockdown has not been as severe as first thought.
I've been stunned at the resilience of the economy to lockdowns. The number of job losses has been less than expected. The impact on GDP has been at the more moderate end of estimates. And what that indicates is that the cost of a lockdown is not what we thought.
Dominic Stevens. Nationally, an average of 219 people have accessed the job seeker benefit each day. New Zealand First has dismissed Labour's plan to extend the life of the Tiwai Point smelter by up to 5 years if it's elected. Under the policy, the Just Transition Unit dedicated to reshaping the country's energy system would be expanded with an extra $5 million a year to support regions beyond Taranaki. New Zealand First's leader Winston Peters says the policy would probably not save a single job in Southland.
To offer $5 million to an outfit that makes $450 million a year for the New Zealand economy, it's got thousands of workers, and the $5 million will go straight to Wellington bureaucrats. That's not a policy, it's a pale form of invitation, but it won't work.
Winston Peters says there is no reason for the smelter to close, and if elected, New Zealand First would keep it open for 2 decades. If a state-by-state travel bubble with Australia is opened by Christmas, it's understood the first route would be between the South Island and New South Wales. Speaking as Foreign Minister, Winston Peters says that as soon as Australia can provide guarantees on safety measures, the bubble will be all go. New South Wales has recorded 0 cases of the coronavirus for the second day in a row, and it's been 4 months now since a case was reported in the South Island. No new cases of COVID-19 have been reported in New Zealand today. Judith Collins has been urged at a Grey Power gathering to embrace her crusher persona and take on Jacinda Ardern more forcefully. The National Party leader gave a spirited speech to Grey Power members in Nelson this afternoon. A member of the audience, Jim Williamson, thanked her for coming to the party's aid, but asked her to drop any attempt to soften her edges.
In some cases, what we need is crusher to take on. Crusher needs to take on Nasher.
Thank you very much. I'm often being accused of being too nice. People always say that. I say, Judith, you're just too nice.
Nationals leader Judith Collins. 21 protesters who changed themselves to machinery and vehicles at a Canterbury coal mine today have been arrested, then released with a formal warning. They were part of a group of 35 from the climate action group Extinction Rebellion, calling on the Coalgate mine operator Bathurst to decommission its operation. The police say 10 of the arrests were for unlawfully interfering with motor vehicles and 11 for trespassing. Flights in and out of Queenstown have resumed after being diverted or cancelled for most of the day. Heavy snowfall and wintry conditions have disrupted many people's travel plans for the first day of the school holidays. Queenstown Airport's operations and safety manager Mike Clay says staff worked hard to clear snow from roads, footpaths and the runway.
For school holidays, you probably find there's 150, 160 people on each A320, and with 14 of those not making it in here, you times that by 2 because they fly in with people and fly out. So that's quite a few people who are disrupted.
Mike Clay. The Labour leader Jacinda Ardern's flight out of Invercargill was cancelled, so she has headed to Dunedin to try and get a flight from there. It's 4 minutes past 5. 3 days of being stuck in a hotel room hasn't proved too tough for the touring Wallabies. Tomorrow, pending negative COVID-19 tests, the Australian rugby players will get out of solitary confinement and be able to begin training in a team bubble in Christchurch as they prepare for the first Bledisloe Cup test against the All Blacks in Wellington next week. The New Zealand-born Wallabies hooker Brandon Paenga-Amosa says he's had no trouble whiling away the hours.
Taking care of my hair, making sure my hair looks good, and making sure I'm keeping it clean. And probably the second one would be I'm a massive Marvel fan, so just been catching up on Marvel starting from the beginning. I think I've watched something like 14 movies so far. And also my bike, it's massive stitch up there. They put an exercise bike in all the front rows rooms, so that's what we've been doing.
Meanwhile, former All Black Ma'anonu is returning to Toulon to play in France's top 14 rugby championship at the age of 38, having been called in as injury cover to their midfield. The Miami Heat will play the Los Angeles Lakers in the NBA basketball final after wrapping up the Eastern Conference final series over the Boston Celtics. Miami have won Game 6 of their series against Boston, 125-113, to give them a 4-2 win in the best-of-7 series. The opening game of the final is on Thursday. Leicester have crushed Manchester City 5-2 to stay on top of the Premier League football standings. In other matches, Leeds beat Sheffield United 1-0, Tottenham and Newcastle drew 1-1, while West Ham trounced Wolverhampton Wanderers 4-0. That's the news.
Testing the limits of Labour's ambitions on child poverty.
We will not achieve that lift in a 3-year term. However, I do want to keep making incremental progress.
An English rugby club mourns the loss of police officer Mathieu Ratana.
It felt as if everyone had really lost a true friend, a true role model.
And COVID-19 delays leave women with endometriosis in agony.
How can surgery for a health condition that may be contributing to crippling pain ever be classified as elective?
We're on it. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. A significant cold outbreak affects the South Island with snow to sea level in the far south. For all of the North Island, showers, some heavy, easing and becoming isolated tomorrow afternoon. Thunderstorms are possible about coastal areas from Waikato to Kapiti until early tomorrow. Severe norwesterly gales for the lower North Island today. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury, showers, possibly heavy, retreating to the ranges tomorrow, becoming fine in Canterbury tonight. Snow lowering to 400 metres later today with gale norwesterlies easing by tonight. Bulla and Westland, showers, some heavy with hail, isolated squally thunderstorms easing tomorrow. Snow lowering to 200 metres for a time later today and early tomorrow. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, snow showers becoming isolated about inland Otago tonight. Heavy accumulations expected above 300 metres for Fiordland, Southland and Clutha. And Chatham Islands, showers, some heavy squally thunderstorms possible tonight and tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora and welcome to Checkpoint. Christmas on Bondi Beach could be on the cards as Australia considers allowing New Zealanders through the arrival gates. Australian officials have initially suggested South Islanders could be allowed into New South Wales by the end of the year, before Aussies are allowed to come here. Sally Murphy reports.
The Australian Tourism Minister says we could be popping the bubbles by Christmas. The travel kind, that is. Simon Birmingham suggested it will initially be a one-way bubble, with New Zealanders able to travel to New South Wales without having to quarantine. Whether they'd have to pay for managed isolation on their return here is still unknown, but Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says they're working towards a two-way system.
Our work has never stopped. Australia has changed up their approach. Previously they were looking to have a whole of Australia bubble with New Zealand. They're now looking at a hotspots regime which could see state-by-state travel. That's going to take just a little bit of work to see how that would be deployed. Our goal is, of course, to make progress but still keep New Zealanders safe.
But she's being cautious about the time frame.
So I'm a bit wary about putting a time frame on it. It would certainly be quicker than waiting for all of Australia because obviously we won't be having travel from Victoria.
Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs Winston Peters believes the deal will be done a lot quicker than people think.
As soon as the Australians can give us a guarantee, and I don't think it's a long way away, it's much sooner than Christmas in my view.
National leader Judith Collins understands Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison wants a bubble with just the South Island.
I think it's an idea that may be able to be done, and I think too, as long as people have tests before they get on a plane, a negative result, and we have COVID tracing and all those things, it is entirely possible. But let's put it this way, let's make sure that everyone's safe.
Ms Collins says people want more clarity about what's going on.
You know, I think too, as people need to understand too, is do they want to stay entirely Fortress New Zealand forever? I think we can keep COVID out. I think we can do a good job on it, but you need a single border agency, as we have promoted, and we would put in place within 100 days to do that. And what you can't do is down this track of having multiple ministers and nobody seems to be in charge.
Queenstown Mayor Jim Bolt says a bubble is vital for his region, which has lost $1.9 billion of revenue due to the border closure.
I can't see Australians coming here and wanting to spend 2 weeks in a hotel room before they can go and do anything. I couldn't see it working until we had pretty much unfettered travel between both countries.
Tourism Industry Association Chief Executive Chris Roberts reckons the chat about the border is positive, but the industry doesn't want to get ahead of itself.
There have been positive signs before. At one point we thought we might have the borders open with Australia in July, and then September, then October, and more recently it's looked like it could be well into next year. So it's positive that there's now talk about it happening before Christmas, but we're not banking on that happening just yet.
Mr Roberts says if Australians have to quarantine once they arrive here, they won't come.
Jump on the plane, safely travel to the other country and enjoy a holiday or visits with friends or attending a sporting event. That's the big prize, if we can have travel across the Tasman without the need for a fortnight's isolation at each end.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade says officials from both sides of the Tasman continue to work together on arrangements for a safe travel zone. It says when the time is right, there will be a range of health and border requirements that need to be met before a bubble is formed. For Checkpoint, Sally Murphy.
COVID's cost Queensland up to $7 billion in lost tourism, and it needs Kiwi visitors now, according to Queensland Tourism Industry Council. As you heard there, New South Wales could be our first quarantine-free destination, but Queensland is desperate to get in on the bubble, and its Tourism Industry Council boss, Daniel Gishwind, believes waiting for 0 community cases before opening the borders is unrealistic, and it's about managing risk.
Well, we should certainly be included. I mean, New Zealand is a very important market for us, for Queensland here. Nearly half of the holiday visitors that come from New Zealand to Australia come to Queensland. As a matter of fact, that's 250,000 people, the holiday visitors on top of the 500,000, not on top, but included in the 500,000 visitors to Queensland from New Zealand every year. So it is a big market, and you bring a lot of value to our economy.
So, well, Sydney seems to be potentially the first cab off the rank in terms of a bubble. Why would that be? I mean, how are you tracking with COVID?
So we have an excellent record here in Queensland. We have very few cases and no infections, for instance, in the last 24 hours. So we're in a very good space, and everybody here, you wouldn't know it. Walking around in Brisbane at the moment here, you wouldn't know there's any COVID risk. We have our measures in place. We have our restrictions in place, but they're pretty relaxed at the moment, and we have a very, very good track record, as does New Zealand. So it's an obvious partnership that could be formed and certainly would be beneficial to both sides of the Tasman. What's standing in the way of it happening? Well, I hope it's not politics. I mean, we do have a state election at the end of the next month, in October, and we have a different coloured government here to the federal government. So we hope that's not an impediment to finding practical solutions and safe solutions for all parties concerned. And we believe it's possible to do this. We strongly believe that the health track record that both New Zealand and Queensland and Australia has allows us to move on and get on with some normality in our lives, and the partnership across the Tasman is very much part of it. What conversations have you been having with, say, for example, the Tourism Minister? Well, we have certainly the Queensland Tourism Minister is very much involved in the discussion, as is the Chief Health Officer here, and they're very concerned, obviously, about the continued track record from a health perspective, but they're also very aware that our economy needs tourism. Our employment levels depend very much on tourism. We have about 250,000 people in Queensland alone that depend on the tourism dollars coming in. So I think we have to increasingly prepare for a reopening of internal borders for a start, but also international borders to a place like New Zealand would be the first practical steps, and that's very much part of the discussion with our state government. So do you think that this would only happen if state borders are open first? Well, I think it stands to reason that would be a really important first step, because I'm not quite sure what the practical arrangements would be in stopping New Zealanders, for argument's sake, travelling, to one state, but then being prevented to other states. That seems a bit odd. But, it would certainly be preferable for us to have the eastern state borders opened here in Australia for a start. That's our priority right now. But New Zealand is practically part of the domestic market anyhow for us, and it would be an important step also.
But nothing is without risk, is it? And so there's issues, for example, our Prime Minister has raised today about transit passengers on flights. It's just one of them, mingling at airports. I mean, what level of risk do you think your state would be prepared to take in opening up this bubble?
Well, I think the risk is very manageable. It's not as if we have many passengers at our international airports at the moment. There's only a handful every day, and they're certainly very well managed and guided into quarantine hotels if they arrive from overseas. So I think it's very easy to manage that, and they're certainly doable.
If we still have some community transmission, and we do at the moment, do you think we should still be allowed to come to Australia? Should it be zero community transmission in order to open up a bubble?
Well, that's very much part of the discussion of the state borders here as well. Is it zero or is it a low number of community transmissions? And our view is that with zero transmissions, the benchmark for state borders here in Australia, that is probably a threshold that is very hard to achieve in the next few months, possibly years. So we're very keen to see a more suppression-based approach rather than elimination-based approach. And we believe a low number of community transmissions with appropriate social distancing rules, tracing rules and tracking rules could be managed.
So you'd take us, even if we still had some community transmission here, you think it's unrealistic to get to a position where there's zero before we start to travel?
I think that is, a relatively unrealistic expectation that we could achieve that and still have our economies function in any way, shape or form. And that's really the position we take. Obviously, the health authorities have a slightly more cautious approach, but we think all evidence has to be put on the table. And the support, the management measures have to be considered for their effectiveness, and they have proven to be very effective here in Queensland and elsewhere in Australia.
So how are things in Queensland at the moment? Because it's tourism. Tourism is your big thing there, and it's a literal hotspot in the summer, which we're heading towards. So how are you all going?
Well, look, it's obviously very tough, and we have many operators that are really struggling and relying on the government support that's thankfully forthcoming, both from federal and state governments. But it has ripped a dramatic hole into our industry and into our economy and the community. You know, in June, for instance, we know that domestic tourism suffered to the tune of nearly $1 billion, June alone, for Queensland, and that is despite the fact that many Queenslanders are travelling within the state, and especially around Brisbane here. We have a lot of activity, and some of the smaller accommodation providers are doing okay. But we have lost billions of dollars of international tourism. We've lost billions of dollars of events tourism, corporate travel from both within Australia and elsewhere. So it has ripped a massive hole to the tune of probably, we estimate, around about $6 to $7 billion at least so far in Queensland alone. So that is a lot of revenue missing from regional communities in our state, and many jobs are at risk as a result of that.
So you need us?
Absolutely, we need you. We want you.
How soon, Daniel? If you're a betting man, how soon do you reckon this would happen?
I reckon it could happen by Christmas. I really think it's possible, and I certainly hope it will be a reality.
And that's Queensland Tourism Industry Council boss Daniel Gishwind. It is almost 19 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Let us know what you think about that. Would you be happy travelling to Australia? Would you feel safe? Who should get to go? Should it just be the people in the South Island, or all of us? And to Sydney or further afield? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. And the second part of that is, would you be happy to have Australians coming here? Let us know your thoughts. Labor's pledged to keep the lights on at TY Point, despite earlier indicating it's a sunset industry. Leader Jacinda Ardern and energy spokesperson Megan Woods visited Invercargill today to pitch their plan for the aluminium smelter. The massive employer contributes 2,600 jobs in the area, which may disappear if Rio Tinto's plan to close next August goes ahead. Our Otago Southland reporter Timothy Brown is in Invercargill and has more.
Give us 3 to 5 years and we'll give Southland a future beyond TY Point. That's Labor's message to the people of the South. If that has a ring of familiarity about it, it's because the plan isn't entirely dissimilar from National's pitch to Southlanders. But Labour's leader, Jacinda Ardern, prefers to point to the plan's differences.
I'd say in so many things, the difference is often about the plan. Our plan is to, yes, support extra time, but then to use that time wisely for exciting opportunities here in Southland around economic development.
To that end, Labour has committed $5 million to setting up a Just Transitions workforce in the region to work alongside Southland's development agencies to identify new opportunities and expand existing ones. Rio Tinto's announcement in July that it would close the smelter next August sounded very firm. But Ms Ardern says she's confident in securing a longer wind-down period for the smelter and its workers.
As we've said, we are very keen to move quickly to provide certainty. The pace of those negotiations, of course, will be down to the progress we can make on some of those really key issues, making sure Rio Tinto restore the site, making sure they give certainty for the workforce.
Energy spokesperson Megan Woods says there's a lot hanging on successful negotiations with Rio Tinto, and not just for Southlanders.
If the smelter were to close in August next year, there'd be around $60 million worth of transmission prices that would have to be redistributed across New Zealand. We'd see roughly $10 to $16 million of that falling in Auckland, and we'd see it split across the country. What this would mean is increased charges for retail consumers and for other businesses.
National's leader, Judith Collins, dismissed Labour as being the party that's too late.
Oh, it's so flattering having the lead of the Labour Party copy our plan. I think that it's probably very late to the party, aren't they? Very late.
And New Zealand First's leader, Winston Peters, also pulled no punches.
Well, invitation's the most sincere form of flattery, but to offer $5 million to an outfit that makes $450 million a year for the New Zealand economy, it's got thousands of workers, and the $5 million will go straight to Wellington bureaucrats. That's not a policy, it's a pale form of invitation, but it won't work.
But in Southland, local and business leaders are receptive to any plan which can keep Tiwai's 1,000 workers employed for longer and give greater certainty to the 1,600 others who have economic ties to the smelter. Southland Mayoral Forum Chair, Tracy Hicks, says several political parties have pitched a plan to extend the life of Tiwai Point. But the key is acting on those plans.
The key date really in this whole equation is December. There needs to be a solid solution in place by December for a transition and a phasing out of Tiwai. If that's not the case, then I've got no doubt that Rio will just move on with its plans it's already announced, and that's to close down in August next year, and that's the last thing we want.
Southland Chamber of Commerce President Neil Makara says while it's reassuring both major parties have committed to extend the closure of Tiwai Point, life after Tiwai is what will matter most to its workers and the region.
There wasn't a lot of detail around that plan from any party at the moment in terms of that. I think there's a vital need, and obviously we've done a fair bit of work down this track in terms of Southland creating these industries, and obviously to engage with whoever's in government afterwards to get their support to ensure that we've got a transition, and they're supporting that actually I think is the key post-election.
Everyone in Southland is waiting with bated breath for the details about what's next from whichever party forms the government. In Invercargill, for Checkpoint, Timothy Brown.
Meanwhile, National's unveiled its plan to help get those out of work back into jobs, as well as its mental health policy. If elected, National says it would give tertiary training providers $4,000 for every unemployed person they successfully retrain and get back into full-time work within a year. On mental health, it's promising a zero suicide strategy and to establish a dedicated ministerial position. Political reporter Yvette McCullough wraps up today's announcements.
Judith Collins was playing up the local connection while campaigning in Nelson today.
And of course this is where a whole chunk of my family originated. Yes. Early settlers.
She and local MP Nick Smith began a day of pledges by promising to prioritise the rebuild of Nelson's hospital if elected.
These buildings are not fit for purpose for modern medical practice.
But the main event for Ms Collins was unveiling Skill Start, National's proposed rapid retraining and job placement scheme to help those who've lost their jobs back into work. Tertiary training providers who successfully retrain someone and get them into full-time work will get $4,000. Ms Collins says this is funded for up to 30,000 people.
This funding creates a very strong incentive and signal to training providers. In other words, we want you focused on things that are going to get people into work. We want you focused on stuff that matters.
Ms Collins says National would also create an under-25 job coach to help young people on the job seeker benefit into the workforce. And she's promising to undo what she calls the expensive and distracting restructuring of the vocational training sector.
We will cut and stop the Rove reforms because they are not in the best interests of New Zealanders. And they're certainly not in the best interests of our regions. So they will be gone. If you want to say by dinner time, would probably be the best one for that one.
Labour Education spokesperson Chris Hipkins says National is in fiscal freefall, making yet more promises its austerity plan will never be able to pay for. He says the incentive for tertiary providers is also untargeted and won't lead to truly sustainable employment.
Tertiary education providers just follow the money. They get people into courses and they churn them through, regardless of whether or not what they're training them in is what businesses and employers actually need.
Further south in Christchurch, National also put forward its mental health policy. Spokesperson Matt Ducey proposing to establish a Minister for Mental Health.
Mental health is bigger than just health, and multiple government departments are part of the solution. That's why National will establish New Zealand's first standalone minister who will take responsibility for our strategy and deliver results.
National is also promising more frontline mental health services and a nationwide zero suicide strategy.
Mental health affects every family, every strata of society, every ethnicity, everybody, and we need to take it seriously. So yeah, it's a big call. But I tell you what, if we don't try to get zero suicides, we'll just keep meandering along.
Donning his health spokesperson hat, Mr Hipkins says National's again making wild promises it won't be able to afford.
Nobody thinks that suicide is acceptable. Every suicide is a tragedy. Simply setting a target of zero suicides isn't going to change that situation, though.
And Labour leader Jacinda Ardern says a standalone minister is a bad call.
Actually, we need to integrate what we do on mental health into our entire health system, and mental health support needs to be provided across healthcare.
While posing for photos with supporters today, Ms Collins joked about the political spectrum.
Right, where do you want this team?
We better have you in the middle.
All right, I'll be in the middle. I'll send for a stop.
But at a Grey Power meeting this afternoon, a supporter called her out for being too soft.
In some cases, what we need is pressure to take on.
Thank you very much. I'm often being accused of being too nice. People always say that. I say, Judith, you're just too nice.
Ms Collins then let rip on Ms Ardern on Ihu Mātau and her refusal to say how she's voting on the cannabis referendum.
Go public on it is what I'm saying.
I'm trying every chance I get, only to put it on the 6 o'clock news. I expect you might hear some more about it this week from me.
A hint perhaps that Ms Collins plans to go full crusher when she faces off with Ms Ardern again for the second leaders' debate on Wednesday night. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Yvette McCullough.
It's been a snowy start for the school holidays, with flurries down to sea level in parts of the lower South Island. Flights were grounded for most of the day, leaving holidaygoers stranded as biting cold temperatures, blizzard-like conditions, road closures and heavy snowfall took hold. Tess Brunton reports.
The snow flurries hit before Fox Glacier Guiding Chief Executive Rob Jewell had even left Wanaka early this morning for the west coast. By the time he reached the Haas Pass, the flurries were thick and sticking to the road.
I struck about 3 to 4 centimetres of good wet heavy snow on the road, so that made for an interesting drive, but it was absolutely sensationally beautiful with the snow all through the trees. Made it very scenic.
Sitting in Fox Glacier Township, Rob Jewell says it's been an interesting weather day.
We've had a real mix of good spring weather. We've got a southerly blasting through. There's intermittent hail shower in there, rain, bit of wind, a little bit of everything. And look, even 10 minutes ago we had a patch of blue sky, but It's since disappeared and we're back into some cloud and rain. So it's a real mixed bag today.
While he's not able to open today, Rob Jules says the cold snap will be a boon for business.
When we get up on the glacier, it is going to be absolutely beautiful up there. At the landing site, it'll be all fresh snow. Such a great trip to be up there. Those rural mountain photos with snow-capped peaks in the background and actually in the snow. It'll be fantastic.
Dean Rabbage farms sheep near Wyndham in southeast Southland. He's thankful they were through most of their lambing before the cold snap hit.
So anything that was born in an exposed place, we just put a wee woolen lamb cover on it. So they'll be fine now. And everything was pretty settled actually. There wasn't any wind, there was just a wee bit of snow coming straight down. So everything was sort of hunkered up in shelter and tussocks under flaxes and trees. So pretty much almost left them alone, but I'll go around them again shortly and see if anything else needs another hand.
While he's doing well, Dean Rabbage says other farmers will be preparing for a rough patch.
You feel for those guys up sort of central Otago, up in the higher country who are just starting it or right in the middle of it. Yeah, feel for them. They're going to have a bit of a hard time over a couple of days, but yeah, it's just one of those things really.
Heavy snowfall forced multiple road closures throughout the day as cars slid into ditches, but the road to Milford Sound remains the only one not to reopen, with up to 50 centimetres of snow potentially settling above 200 metres today. Most main mountain highways have road snowfall warnings. Further south, Stewart Islanders woke to snow covering the ground and beaches, with more falling throughout the morning. John Spraggan has been living on Rakiora for about 28 years. He says snow is pretty rare.
The kids have been out playing in it for sure, but it's not something that you can ski in or anything like that. But, the young ones would have really enjoyed it.
He says it hasn't stopped the ferry from running to the main island, but planes were grounded.
All the bush this morning was all covered, but now looking out my window, everything's green. Even we've had blue sky until a couple of minutes ago, but then suddenly it started to cloud over again. Yeah, I think the worst part of it was probably the very, very heavy rain would be the most disruptive. The snow is something you can put up with.
The first departing flight of the day in Queenstown was de-iced and in the air without a problem. But less than an hour later, the snow started falling and settling, with staff working hard to clear the roads, footpaths and runway, and poor visibility forcing flights to be cancelled for most of the day. The airport's Operations and Safety General Manager, Mike Clay, says it's an unfortunate start to the school holidays.
It does create a bit of chaos in the terminal. Really fortunate we're down at alert level 1, so people can move around the terminal and work with the airlines to have their flights rebooked. But really it just creates inconvenience for our customers.
Usually between 150 and 160 people are on each A320 plane. That adds up when at least 14 flights in and 14 out couldn't fly. Sitting in an office next to the runway, Mike Clay says fresh snow blankets the airport as far as he can see.
I'm looking across our apron area, which is clear, so you can see the asphalt. All of the grass is covered in snow. There's a lot of snow sitting on equipment airside, and the runway is clear, and then you can see snow on the other side, and that's about as far as you can see, actually. So the recreational centre across the other side of the airport from the terminal, you can barely see it.
The first of the school holiday flights landed just after 3 this afternoon. Heavy snowfall warnings are in place for parts of the lower South Island until tomorrow morning. While wintry conditions have gripped the start of the school holidays, Met Service says it will start to warm up from Wednesday. For Checkpoint, Cortes Brunton, TNA.
And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, could more yachties be illegally heading into New Zealand waters with cyclone season approaching and no exemptions on the horizon? An abuse victim describes his life in state care as a horror movie that just won't end. Who are the winners and losers in the latest political poll? And speaking of numbers, how much tax does Donald Trump pay? Do get in touch about anything you've heard on the program so far this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time though for the headlines now with Susanna.
Westpac Chief Economist Dominic Stevens is stunned at the resilience of Auckland's economy to last month's Level 3 lockdown. New figures show only 93 Aucklanders have gone on the job seeker benefit since August the 7th, a fraction of the 250 job losses a day forecast by Auckland Council. The Foreign Minister Winston Peters says a travel bubble between the South Island and New South Wales could go ahead as soon as Australia can give safety guarantees. New South Wales has recorded 0 cases of the coronavirus for the second day in a row, and it's been many weeks since a case was reported in the South Island. No new cases of COVID-19 have been reported in New Zealand today, and the number of active cases has fallen from 59 to 55, half of them imported and half from the community. The Health Ministry has tested all 44 close contacts of the 3 community cases reported last week, and apart from 2 whose results are pending, all have tested negative. 21 protesters who chained themselves to machinery and vehicles at a Canterbury coal mine have been arrested, then released with a formal warning. They were part of a group of 35 from the climate action group Extinction Rebellion, calling on the Coalgate mine operator Bathurst to decommission its operation. Wellington City Mission has been awarded $10 million to build a community housing hub, which will include a social supermarket instead of a food bank. The hub in the suburb of Mount Cook will have 35 supportive housing units for long-term homeless people and is due for completion in 2022. Snow and wintry conditions have disrupted travel for many people on the first day of the school holidays. However, flights in and out of Queenstown have now resumed after being diverted or cancelled for most of the day. A 100-kilogram concrete turtle that went missing from Tahunanui Beach Playground in Nelson has turned up in Blenheim. The Marlborough District Council says the rogue turtle has been found at Pollard Park. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, there is some breaking news. Dreamworld's parent company, Ardern Leisure, has been fined $3.6 million over the deaths of 4 people on the Thunder River Rapids ride in 2016. Ardern Leisure pleaded guilty to 3 breaches of workplace health and safety laws and was sentenced a short time ago. New Zealand woman Cindy Lowe was among the 4 killed when their raft collided with an empty raft and flipped in October 2016. Auckland is now the most pessimistic region in the country about its economic future, overtaking Otago. That's despite the latest data showing the extent of job losses during the city's recent lockdowns are nowhere near as bad as predicted. Auckland Council had forecast 250 jobs a day would go during Level 3 restrictions, but official figures show the employment costs are far lower than first feared. Amy Williams filed this report.
Bucking the trend is Rocketworks, a gaming studio that's hiring, not firing. Chief Executive Dean Hall says the business hit a low before the first nationwide lockdown, making some staff redundant.
Since then, things have actually been going pretty well as we adjusted, so much so that we actually increased our staff from 59 just before the first one through to 73 staff now, and we're actually planning to hire another 10 by the end of the year.
Rocketworks is about to move into the top floors of Auckland's newest waterfront tower. Mr Hall says the business has fared well.
We realised that everybody else in the world was facing the same issue. So we've been leveraging the fact that New Zealand's largely unscathed from COVID to be able to do our most collaborative work when others are really struggling.
A Westpac regional economic survey shows 19% of the city's households expect the economy to shrink over the coming year, the most pessimistic in the country. But it's not all doom and gloom. An average 93 people per day have gone on the job seeker benefit in Auckland since the 7th of August, days before the city's Level 3 lockdown. That's less than half the anticipated number. Nationally, an average 219 people have accessed the job seeker benefit each day. Westpac Chief Economist Dominic Stevens says the effect of lockdown has not been as severe as first thought.
I've been stunned at the resilience of the economy to lockdowns. The number of job losses has been less than expected. The impact on GDP has been at the more moderate end of estimates. What that indicates is that the cost of a lockdown is not what we thought.
He says it's easier to predict where jobs will be lost.
The economy has been hit hard by COVID, but it is more adaptable and more able to weather the hit than people gave it credit for initially.
Some businesses are taking advantage of gaps in the market. In Auckland's central city, the once busy Skyworld food court at the top of Queen Street has been deserted and only 3 stalls remain. The building's operations manager, June Go, says most businesses left after the first full-scale lockdown.
The COVID-19 situation that impacted really bad on our business and even on this entire building. All the business owner here, we suffer a lot.
He says they opened a bakery, Bake My Day, in the food court 2 weeks ago.
I see customer consistently coming in, but obviously the sales is not that good as I expected. Probably this business will be successful, but in the meantime, we need to survive.
Mr. Go expects it'll be 2 years before business picks up. Next week, a comprehensive business opinion survey by the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research will provide another insight into the current state of the economy, which is officially in its first recession in a decade. For Checkpoint, Amy Williams.
Let's stick with the business theme and go to business news now with Nicholas Poynton. Hi, Nicholas. So we talked about this before, inland revenue and crypto investors and how they were planning to do a bit of a clampdown. So do we know exactly how they're going to do that now?
Yeah, they've finally given us a bit of a heads up there, because at the time, you may not remember, but when I spoke about this at the beginning of the month, this was about IRD, crypto assets, how they're going to tax this area. Crypto assets, they've tended to exist in quite a grey area. IRD, they put out this guidance where they said they're going to treat crypto assets like property for tax purposes. And at the time, you actually asked me a really good question. You asked, well, how will IRD actually know who has or who hasn't got crypto assets? Well, it appears that IRD has given us an answer to your question, albeit about 3 weeks late. So they have actually sent out letters to all the crypto firms in New Zealand requesting that they hand over their customers' names, their dates of birth, their addresses, as well as the types of assets they own and the value of those assets in New Zealand dollar terms. And why this is really interesting is the fact that IRD hasn't publicly announced this. It's the firms who have received the letters. Those are the ones who started making some noise about this over the weekend.
Are they compelled to give it up?
Well, this you raise a good question. I'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
So the crypto asset firm I spoke to today says this move isn't actually too surprising, because it seems that the IRD is really following the lead taken by tax offices in the US and Australia when it comes to firms handing over their customers' data. The main reason why it was disappointed, though, is because one of the core tenets of cryptocurrency is privacy. And it's not necessarily by those people who engaged in dodgy dealings, but it's by people who like the anonymity that this form of currency gives to people, and the fact that it effectively cuts banks out of the equation. It's very decentralized, and this sounds like I'm quoting all these buzzwords, but this is what crypto investors really like about it. But the firm I spoke to today, they actually initially sought legal advice about whether or not they actually had to hand over this personal information. What they found, though, after consulting with a number of lawyers, was that there was actually no legal grounds for them to be able to refuse this. So they are in a situation where they are going to have to comply with IRD's request. That's what they're in the process of doing right now. But this is just one firm, though. Keep that in mind. This is a really interesting space, and judging from some of the comments I've seen in sort of like cryptocurrency Facebook groups and forums, there are a lot of people who are upset about this. So it remains to be seen whether or not we'll see any of these firms who will take a firm stand and not comply with the IRD's request on this.
Well, it's kind of interesting because when you sign up for the bank, you have to fill out a form with a tax rate for, if you're earning interest, etc.
Well, it seems only fair that you would have to pay interest on or pay tax on these assets, right? But I guess these people have sort of enjoyed the space that they've been in for quite some time and don't want to comply. But having said that, most crypto investors do actually pay their tax. There is a small group who don't, and most of the time it's because people don't actually understand their obligations, and there's an even smaller group who try and skirt the system.
Well, I love this story. Do come back and tell us more as it builds. Okay, so one of the country's biggest companies has today announced it's expecting to make less this year. Which one is it?
It's A2 Milk.
Oh, okay. So it sent the NZX on a bit of a upsy-down did it?
So this is the country's second biggest stock, A2 Milk. It revised down down its earnings expectations for the half year. It now says it expects to make between $725 and $775 million for the half year. It's no small amount, down from $805 million the year earlier. And the reason because of this is, well, due to COVID-19, which has put a lid on the sales through the Daigou channel. And that's essentially when Chinese tourists come to New Zealand and they buy up lots of our goods. In this case, it would be A2's infant formula. They buy lots of this, they buy it by the caseload, and they would take it back to China, or they'd send it back there, and then they would go on to resell it. Well, we don't really have tourists at the moment, and this has affected A2's sales of its infant formula, and it's seen sales of this really plummet. However, when they put out this announcement to the market at about 8:30 this morning, they really reassured everyone. They told them that their underlying consumer demand in China is still strong, and they believe the short-term impact of this will be only temporary. But in reality, that sort of hinges on what really happens with our border restrictions at the moment. And the market, when they heard this, well, they didn't really like it. Its share price, well, A2 Milk's share price, it fell by 9.7%, and that's about $1.79 per share, and let's take it down to $16.65. But A2 Milk, it's a really big company. When it moves, the market moves. So when the market opened for trading this morning, it fell by 2%. But what we've seen is it seems that the market or investors' confidence, they've really picked themselves up, dusted off for the dirt and grime, and they believe market trading really rallied over the course of the day. And the NZX 50, it finished up slightly by 0.04%, or by 5 points. That's to 11,802. And while I'm on the markets, our own dollar, it's up 65.6 US cents. It's at 92.9 Australian, 51.3 British pence, and gold is essentially unchanged. It's at 1,861 US dollars an ounce.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with our business news there. An ocean cruising club says the actions of a German crew that's being detained after sailing across New Zealand's closed border are probably a sign of desperation, although it doesn't condone breaking maritime rules. The 3 yachties on board the Anita arrived in Opua in the Bay of Islands despite their border exemption application being denied. Immigration says the 2 men and a woman treated New Zealand's COVID-19 regulations with contempt, and they will be flown back to Germany. In exceptional circumstances, the Director General of Health may grant foreign vessels permission to enter New Zealand, but they need to demonstrate a humanitarian reason or a compelling need for the ship to be delivered here for business. The Ocean Cruising Club's roving Rear Commodore, Guy Chester, has tried unsuccessfully to get exemptions for hundreds of yachties in the South Pacific who are facing a fast-approaching cyclone season.
Look, I think it's a very sad situation. I need to say that the Ocean Cruising Club does not condone yachts entering a country or attempting to enter a country when the border is closed. But we are very concerned that we have yachts throughout the South Pacific that are in COVID limbo inadvertently, and they've got nowhere to go to get out of the cyclone season. And, maybe Anita is a sign of the desperation that boats have. We hope no more do this, but we really hope that the New Zealand government recognises that this is an urgent situation. The cyclone season is about to start, and we need to allow yachts to get out of the cyclone season, out of the cyclone zone, and seek refuge.
Guy, do you think others will be tempted to run the gauntlet? Try and get here?
Oh, look, I sincerely hope not, and we never would condone that. And, no, we hope not. But what we hope is that if anything good comes of this situation of one boat pushing the boundaries, is let's realise that this is a serious issue of the cyclone season, and the cyclones are coming, and boats need to have safe refuge.
Immigration New Zealand has come out today and said that it's important people on these boats take control of the situation. Now, the argument is that maybe you should just turn around and go home or go to somewhere where there is safe harbour.
Look, there isn't anywhere if you're in the middle of the Pacific where there is safe harbour. Boats cannot turn around. They can't sail home to Germany from French Polynesia. That would be sailing around Cape Horn, I'm sorry, but that's not a response. There are some yachts that did have the ability to leave their boat in a marina or a boatyard and fly home over the last few months. However, the marinas and the boatyards are now full. There is nowhere to leave home. The issue is that there are more boats than there are facilities because normally they go to New Zealand and Australia for the cyclone season. It's just not practical to send boats home. As far as the cyclone season is coming, the Ocean Cruising Club first wrote to the New Zealand government in April. We knew this was going to be an issue because boats were already caught in the middle knowing they'd have to go somewhere. We could have been working collaboratively with the New Zealand government since April, with the Australian government as well, since April to find a solution. We were told by letter at the end of June that there would be an exemption process on a compelling and humanitarian need. We waited until the end of July for the forms and the availability to be filled out for that. We were patient about that. And then on the website it said cyclone refuge is not a compelling reason. So we have been pushing and trying to get that recognised. We have developed quarantine aboard protocols which have proven to work in places like the Azores and Grenada, which have provided refuge and let boats go through or have cyclone refuge. Those protocols we've been working on with Whangarei Marina and Bay of Islands Marina. Now, it's ironic that we've been working with those marinas to develop those quarantine aboard protocols, and they're going to be used for New Zealand yachts that arrive in New Zealand, but they're not good enough for foreign yachts to provide cyclone refuge.
Guy, the other issue that has been raised is that it's tough for yachties to get insurance in the South Pacific during cyclone season, and that is one of the primary reasons that they want to come here. And that makes it an economic reason, not a humanitarian reason. Is that the case?
Oh, look, for a lot of the yacht, their yacht is their major asset. It's their house. And so, yes, insurance is an issue. And obviously some yachties self-insure, so it's their issue. For my suggestion, it's a risk. Now, the other risk is that if a cyclone does occur, New Zealand is regularly providing aid to its Pacific Island nation neighbours when the cyclone occurs. By leaving the yachts here, we're putting more pressure on the emergency services in these small island nations. That's not something we or anybody wants to do, and New Zealand should not condone. New Zealand should realise that leaving these boats in areas where there's a cyclone, potentially a cyclone, is inappropriate. It's putting pressure on these small island nations that shouldn't have to put up with it.
But just because someone can't get insurance for cyclone season, does that mean New Zealand should be the soft touch and let the boats in?
No, I don't think that should be the only reason. If insurance was the only reason, it's about the property and the families. There are couples, there are families with small kids on board. This is their home. We shouldn't fixate on the insurance. We should fixate on these are people with their homes, with families, couples who need somewhere to go. We're not pushing to go to New Zealand because we want to see New Zealand as a soft touch. We're pushing because that is where boats normally go, and New Zealand normally welcomes with open arms.
Are lives at risk as a consequence of these boats not being able to get to New Zealand?
Look, I don't want to be over-dramatic about it. What I want to say is that we all know what happens when a cyclone hits yachts in an anchorage that is not a cyclone refuge.
I know you don't want to be over-dramatic, but if you're wanting to get into New Zealand on the grounds of humanitarian reasons, then basically you're being told, aren't you, that life or limb needs to be at risk. So do you meet that threshold or not in your mind?
What we've been told is that by the Director-General of Health, very upsettingly in the most recent letter, is that yachts can come when there's a cyclone. That cyclones now, what is a safe and prudent navigation approach is to remove yourself from the cyclone season zone and be in a safe anchorage prior to the cyclone season. No, that's not a compelling reason. But okay, if there is actually a cyclone, you can sail there then. I mean, I'm sorry, but I find that ludicrous to tell yachts that once there is a cyclone, they can sail to New Zealand.
And that was Guy Chester of the Ocean Cruising Club. He was speaking to us via Skype from Papaiti in Tahiti. It is 7 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Let us know what you think of that. Do you think that those yachties who are in the South Pacific meet the threshold for entry into New Zealand on humanitarian grounds? They say cyclone season starts around the 1st of November. They want to get into harbour and they would usually come to New Zealand. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Remember, they would also have to quarantine if they arrive by water. $750. That's what the New York Times says President Trump paid in federal taxes in 2016, the year he was elected. The paper says it has obtained 2 decades of Mr. Trump's tax records after a long battle by the president to keep them private. They're reported to detail chronic financial losses and years of tax avoidance. The BBC's Peter Bowes reports.
Once again, Donald Trump and his tax returns, the story that's dogged the president ever since he announced he was running for office and long before as a businessman. Now, the New York Times says it's obtained tax return data for Mr. Trump dating back more than 2 decades, along with the hundreds of companies that make up his business organisation and detailed information from his first 2 years in the White House. The paper says the data shows his finances are under stress, beset by losses with struggling properties and hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. It reports that Mr. Trump paid only $750 in federal income taxes in the year he won the presidency, and another $750 during his first year in office. He paid no income tax at all in 10 of the previous 15 years, according to the paper. This, it says, was largely because he reported losing much more money than he made. The New York Times says the records reveal the hollowness, but also the wizardry behind the self-made billionaire image. Flouting presidential tradition, Mr. Trump has long refused to make his tax affairs public. He's always insisted his returns were the subject of an audit by the US tax authorities, preventing him from releasing details. Speaking at a news conference at the White House, he was quick to deny the latest story.
It's fake news. It's totally fake news. Made up, fake. We went through the same stories. You could have asked me the same questions 4 years ago. I had to litigate this and talk about it. Totally fake news. No, actually, I paid tax, and you'll see that as soon as my tax returns. It's under audit. They've been under audit for a long time.
A lawyer for the Trump Organization said the New York Times story was riddled with gross inaccuracies, and he questioned its timing. It was, he said, part of an ongoing smear campaign in the run-up to the election. It follows Mr. Trump's controversial nomination of a Conservative judge to sit on the US Supreme Court. It also marks the start of a pivotal week in the campaign when the President and Joe Biden will finally go head-to-head on TV. Peter Bowes, BBC News, Los Angeles.
The Wallabies' time confined to their hotel rooms is nearly over, so long as they all test negative for COVID-19 today. In New Zealand for 2 Bledisloe Cup matches next month, the Australian side are on day 3 of their 14-day mandatory isolation in a Christchurch hotel. If the entire touring party returns negative COVID tests, they'll have the freedom to train as a full squad tomorrow. Clay Wilson reports.
The Wallabies arrived in Christchurch on Friday night and were escorted to their 4-star hotel, the Chateau on the Park, by the New Zealand Defence Force. While their movements have been heavily limited, Kiwi-born hooker Brandon Paenga Amosa has enjoyed the 3 days.
I must be honest, the isolation has been pretty cool, eh? I know myself probably put on a couple of kegs being in here because the food here is unreal, eh? But I'm excited to get out and hit the field a bit, lose a couple of kilos that I put on sitting in this room. But it's exciting. I know all the boys are itching to get out on the field.
The 24-year-old Queensland Reds player hasn't had trouble filling the time.
The 2 biggest things are firstly taking care of my hair, making sure my hair looks good and making sure I'm keeping it clean. And probably the second one would be I'm a massive Marvel fan. So just been catching up on Marvel starting from the beginning. The first Marvel and then getting straight through. I think I'm halfway through now. I think I've watched something like 14 movies so far since we left. And also my bike, they put a bike in our room. It's a massive stitch up there. They put an exercise bike in all the front rows room, so that's what we've been doing.
The Wallabies' likely first day of training tomorrow comes as a cold snap sweeps up the South Island, with snow falling to sea level in some places. Paenga Amosa says, given his Kiwi roots, he's ready for the grim weather, but admits that won't be the same for the whole Australian squad.
Oh man, well it wouldn't make sense there being snow on the field if it was in New Zealand, eh? So I know, yeah, well if it's cold, if it's wet, that's what we expected, especially down here in the South Island. I mean, it would be the dream if it was nice and sunny, but I guess that's just Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. That's what you come here and expect, so that's what I'm expecting. But it'll be a massive shock to a couple of other boys that aren't expecting that, so I'm excited for it.
The Wallabies are set to train at the Linwood Rugby Club during the rest of their 2-week quarantine. For Checkpoint, Clay Wilson.
Seeing as we're talking about Aussies travel and quarantine, let's stick with it. Here's some of your feedback on whether we should have a bubble with Australia, one state or more than one state. And there's the idea that people from the South Island will be able to potentially go to New South Wales first. Peter says, how do you qualify as a South Islander? Good point. Another listener says, what about Niue, Cook Islands and other Pacific Islands? They need us now too. Someone else not so keen on the old bubble. How many COVID deaths is Mr Queensland willing to risk? Idiot, they say. And another listener agrees, please, no Australian tourists until zero community transmission in the whole of Australia. Someone else says if we open up the one-way bubble to Australia, the only thing it's going to do is hurt our tourism industry, which is going reasonably well with local spending.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata tēnei. New figures show Auckland job losses have been far fewer than predicted despite last month's lockdown. The council forecast 250 jobs a day would go during level 3, but the job seeker figures show the actual number was less than half that. Amy Williams reports.
An average of 93 people a day have gone on the job seeker benefit in Auckland since August the 7th, days before level 3 was reimposed. Another employment indicator tells a similar story, showing slightly more jobs in August than before the pandemic. Nationally, an average of 219 people have accessed the job seeker benefit each day. Westpac chief economist Dominic Stephen says the cost of lockdown has not been as severe as feared, and he's stunned at the resilience of the economy. This is Amy Williams.
Judith Collins says the National Party's reskilling and retraining policy will get people back into jobs. National is promising, if elected, to pay tertiary providers $4,000 for every unemployed person they retrain and get back into work within a year. Ms Collins says the funding would send a strong signal to providers to focus on training that leads to employment. She says the tech sector could benefit from it.
There's no reason at all why people can't train into some of those jobs, but it's also important that we let people know that the expectation when they go to a polytechnic to learn something, which obviously, people are trying to do it to get jobs, is that there needs to be jobs available to them.
Nationals leader Judith Collins. An Australian company has been fined nearly $4 million over the deaths of 4 people on a Gold Coast theme park ride 4 years ago. Ardern Leisure, the parent company of Dreamworld, had pleaded guilty to 3 breaches of workplace health and safety laws. New Zealand woman Cindy Lowe was among the 4 people killed when their raft collided with an empty raft on the Thunder River Rapids ride. A group of South Island tourism operators has approached the Auditor-General with their worries about a controversial government fund. The Strategic Assets Protection Program has been criticised by dozens of operators for creating what they see as an uneven playing field. The group hasn't ruled out seeking a judicial review. A spokesperson says it's written to the Auditor-General asking for the fund to be investigated. The Wellington City Mission is hoping the creation of what it calls a social supermarket will give the people it helps more dignity when asking for food. The mission is one of the largest charitable distributors of food in the Wellington region. The missioner Murray Aldridge says people will be able to choose their own food from shelves and not have to pay for it.
The idea of the social supermarket is that people are invited to come and shop, and they can choose the things that they want, the things that they like to eat. And the idea is that the difficult challenge for people of coming and asking someone for food is made a wee bit easier and a wee bit more dignified.
Murray Aldridge, the facility is planned as part of a new community housing hub in the suburb of Mount Cook. The first day of the school holidays has been a wintry one as a cold front gripped the lower South Island. Snow flurries reached down to sea level in some places and even landed on beaches on Rakiura. Tess Brunton reports.
Flights in and out of Queenstown were grounded for most of the day, leaving holiday goers stranded as heavy snowfall, biting cold temperatures and multiple road closures took hold. Heavy snowfall warnings have been issued for Fiordland, Southland, Stewart Island and Clutha until tomorrow morning, with watches in place for other parts of the South Island. Met Service says the wintry conditions should start to ease from Wednesday. Tess Brunton, TNA.
And just to hand, the latest One News Colmar Brunton poll gives Labour 47% support and National 33%. Labour is down 1% on the last poll and National up 2%. ACT is on 8% and the Greens 7%. It's just past 4 minutes past 6. The UFC boss Dana White says Israel Adasanya has proved he is set to be MMA's next big superstar. The Nigerian-born New Zealander defended his world middleweight title in Abu Dhabi yesterday, and White says it's hard to overstate just how impressive Adesanya's performance was.
That shouldn't have been the fight that happened tonight. It should have been a much tougher fight. But you can't be disappointed when you have somebody that's as talented as Adasanya is, and he comes out and imposes his will and literally dismantles a guy as good and as tough as Costa.
UFC boss Dana White. New Zealand Rugby has received some unusual support from the Wallabies. Wallabies coach Dave Rennie is backing New Zealand Rugby's desire to have the All Blacks home by Christmas. Doubt has been cast on whether the Rugby Championship in Australia will go ahead, as New Zealand Rugby says it never agreed to the 6-week schedule that would see the All Blacks play their last game on December 12th. Rennie believes Rugby Australia should try and help.
For a long time, we thought all the games were going to be played in New Zealand. And at that stage, we asked if we could get home to quarantine for 2 weeks and be home for Christmas. And it'd be hypocritical of us now to not support New Zealand when we thought it was a good idea. There's talk of a bubble opening up between New South Wales and New Zealand. If that comes in before Christmas, then it's a non-issue.
The Wallabies will begin training tomorrow after 3 days in quarantine in Christchurch. Pending negative COVID-19 tests, the Wallabies will be able to train in a team bubble as they prepare for the first Bledisloe Cup test against the All Blacks in Wellington next week. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Michael Bunce, Chief Scientist with the nation's Environmental Protection Authority, often between a rock and a hard place. Nick Bollinger samples the latest from Kiwi bluesman Darren Watson. Peter Lamp assesses the provincial rugby season so far. And we start a new series in partnership with Auckland's Going West Festival, celebrating art and literature under the shadow of the Waitakaris. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. A significant cold outbreak affects the South Island with snow to sea level in the far south. For all the North Island, showers, some heavy, easing and becoming isolated tomorrow afternoon. Thunderstorms possible about coastal areas from Waikato to Kapiti until early tomorrow. Severe norwesterly gales for the lower North Island tonight. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury, showers, possibly heavy, retreating to the ranges tomorrow, but becoming fine in Canterbury tonight. Snow lowering to 400 metres later tonight with gale norwesterlies easing. Bulla and Westland showers, some heavy with hail and isolated squally thunderstorms easing tomorrow. Snow lowering to 200 metres for a time later tonight and early tomorrow. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, snow showers, becoming isolated about inland Otago tonight. Heavy accumulations expected above 300 metres for Fiordland, Southland and Clutha. Chatham Island, snow, some heavy, squally thunderstorms possible tonight and tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7.5 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Labour has taken a slight hit and would need help from the Greens to form a government, according to the latest One News Colmar Brunton poll. Tonight's poll puts Labour on 47% and National on 33%. ACT continues to rise, now on 8%. New Zealand First continues to tumble down to 1%. Lara Greaves is a politics lecturer at Auckland University and she joins me now. Good evening, Lara. Kia ora. What are your first impressions? Kind of interesting.
Well, I think my first impression is we're kind of really the big question mark over this election and what's going to happen over the next
2 to 3 weeks is, are Labor going to hold on enough to be able to govern alone? And like at the moment on current numbers, there's a potential that, say, if the election were held today, just with the kind of variation in sampling and polling, that they actually would have the numbers. So it's kind of hard to tell as to whether that will happen. But I think generally this is part of a downward trend for Labor, but a downward trend from like ridiculously high polling numbers a few months ago when they were back up at like, say, 62%.
Yeah, because if we look at the last 3 Colmars, that is the trend. So it was, down a few points from last time, and the time before that down 5 points. So the trend is downwards for them. National has had a bit of a bump here, but is it too little too late?
I think it is ultimately too little too late. I think Judith Collins has a lot to turn around in a short time period. I think she knew that on becoming leader that would be a challenge. I think that generally the downward trend from Labor is not necessarily anything to do with, say, their incompetency or National's competency. It's more a sort of function of the fact that New Zealand has been through this, collective trauma of COVID-19 and the associated crisis. And when we know from studies upon studies over the decades that whenever there's a crisis in a country, that people tend to cling to the incumbent government. So we're just really seeing Labor decline from those record high poll numbers.
Yeah, so is gratitude for that wearing off then?
I think potentially over time that's what happens, and it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily gratitude in that it's like just that kind of natural shock. When something happens in our environment, we tend to cling to what we know, and that's like well replicated in political psychology. So I think just that kind of initial shock of COVID is wearing off, and people are now getting adjusted to their new normal.
Let's look at the minors for a second, right? So New Zealand First, although it doesn't like to be called a minor party, the trend, if we look at the Colmar poll, they have actually been gaining. So in July, 2%, according to the Colmar. The one before this, 2.4. Now plunging down to 1. And if we look at ACT, it's going up, but National's gone up. So from that, can we conclude that New Zealand First has bleeding votes to ACT?
I think with any given poll, there's actually quite small numbers. The News Hub Read research poll attempted to look at numbers of voters crossing across, but when you worked it out, we're talking like a few people in a poll. And so it's not necessarily a reliable effect or something that we could rely on, but it does seem like New Zealand First voters are kind of, the old metaphor of rats on a sinking ship, that they're leaving because it actually is looking like their vote is going to be wasted. And I think New Zealand First voters and minor party voters generally are a little bit more strategic than major party voters. So they know, to go somewhere else, to put their vote somewhere else at this point. And we generally don't ever like to count Winston Peters out in politics, and we're normally quite reticent about saying, oh no, Winston Peters is out or New Zealand First is out. But I think at this point we probably have to say there's only a very, very slim chance of them coming back.
You're calling it, Lara, for New Zealand First?
Yeah, I'm pretty much calling it. I mean, you don't even really want to. Like, everyone is afraid to, but, they're down at 1%. Normally they don't do as well in the polls as they do on election day, but this is several percent that they have to try and come back from right before an election, and it's looking rather unlikely.
Because usually they get, about a 2% bump. So if they're on 1, they're still not going to make it. Greens, 7%. They tend to go down at the actual poll. So are they out of the danger zone, do you think, the Greens?
They're kind of heading there. Like at the moment, because everyone's kind of goes when they see a poll, they go, "Oh, phew, the Greens are safer at 5%." But yeah, totally. Like what you just said, we normally, for the Greens to be safe, they do need to be a couple of percentage points up. I guess we'll see, especially now. People are kind of settled into the campaign and settled in, and potentially some more votes will come off Labor over the next couple of weeks.
So is this I know on these numbers, Labor doesn't have enough to rule on its own, but is this sort of a first-past-the-post election under an MMP banner?
In a way it is, but you know what we're going to see now? Firstly, with New Zealand First out, we're going to have a 4-party parliament, and that is going to be, other than being a bit dull for a lot of us that like to follow politics, that's going to create an incredibly strange dynamic where Labor, they've kind of got this flank party of the Greens on the left, and National is going to have a flanked party of ACT on the right. We're not going to have any of those centre parties that have that sort of coalition or blackmail potential, that what political scientists like to call it. So we're going to have this strange kind of 2-party combo system, and so what that's going to do is it's going to put a lot of power in ACT or the Green Party, depending on, of course, who's governing after which election. And I think that sets up quite a sort of real tail wagging the dog situation for future elections, because we've seen that it's very, very difficult for any parties to come back from being outside of Parliament.
You think the loss of any minor parties is, well, it's bad for democracy generally, don't you? Is that your position?
I think it is when there's not so many parties to negotiate with, when they've only got ACT or the Green Party to negotiate with. I think that kind of tends to back the major parties into a corner. Now, some people would argue that's good because at the moment all the major parties do is tinker around the edges and everything's a bit dull. But on the other hand, that does create someone like David Seymour gives him a lot of power if it was, say, National, or the Greens, it gives them a little bit more power, and that can be quite freaky to a lot of voters, this idea that a minor party will, with 7-8% of the vote, will wield a disproportionate amount of power. So that's where we kind of hit that point where it's like, is it time to look at our 4% threshold at MMP?
So given that the trend in the Colmar poll, at least, is Labor going down and National just getting a few gains here and there, it's a time game, isn't it? So early votes, 30th of September for overseas, and then advance voting starts on October the 1st. Is it to Labor's advantage that a lot of people early vote?
I don't necessarily think. I think because so many people are early voting, 47% of voters did advance voting last election, and this time it's definitely going to be above 50% with a lot of people's worries around COVID. So I think we will see a good at least half of the votes being advance voting. I think that when you hit that point of the electorate being an advance vote, that you kind of hit a point where it's no longer biased, that we can sit there on election night and go, oh, okay, we know we've got this kind of institutional knowledge the advance vote is going to go one way or the other. So I think on election night, like while we will be watching some of those votes come in, I don't necessarily think that we can like call it that Labor voters are necessarily going to go early or National voters.
Interesting, Lara, that this poll was after the leaders' debate, and I know that generally televised debates don't swing voters, but hey, got a shift after some people call it for Judith Collins on the night.
Yeah, I think it's only a couple of percentage points. So again, it's not really clear whether it's. So I'm a bit suspicious of like One News doing a poll a week after. It's almost like they're trying to ramp up the kind of competition or debate in a way and kind of make this into some kind of race when it really doesn't seem like much of a race. But it's also kind of hard because I think that generally Labor is trending downwards. So I think 1% in a week is not a huge deal. But the 2% for National is interesting, and it will be really interesting to see what happens in this next couple of weeks. But like I say, it's really hard to separate out the effects of Judith Collins having a fairly good debate performance from just that general downward trend from those record highs that Labor had months ago.
Great to talk to you. That is Lara Greaves, who is a political lecturer at Auckland University, speaking there on the latest political poll. It is almost 16 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. 21 protesters have been arrested after chaining themselves to machinery and vehicles at a coal mine in Canterbury. More than 30 activists arrived at the Bathurst mine in Colgate, 70 kilometres west of Christchurch, in the early hours and bitter cold this morning. The members of the International Climate Action Group, Extinction Rebellion, are calling on the mine operator to decommission their operation and for the government to support transition away from fossil fuels. Alicia Foon was at the protest and filed this report.
It was 5 degrees Celsius when 33 activists arrived at the coal mine in Darfield. They blocked the entrance to the site, attaching themselves to 2 cars, one with its wheels taken off, while 2 people sat about 8 metres high on top of 2 giant 3-legged wooden structures. They held flags showing the Extinction Rebellion logo, an hourglass with a circle, and a banner which read "Closed for climate repairs." The mine, owned and operated by Bathurst Resources, produces low sulphur coal, primarily fueling the local dairy industry. Activist Zoe Deans explains the point of their protest.
We're here today calling on Bathurst to withdraw their application to expand the mine. We're asking Fonterra to quit coal completely and quickly, and we're calling on the government to help support companies like Bathurst transition workers into good jobs in clean industries.
The activists range from 16 to 65 years old. The group's youngest, Kira Foley, is a student at high school. She says despite it being school holidays, she was keen to do something.
Well, I suppose the science is pretty clear that we're in a climate emergency, and I don't know, I guess I just can't sit and let it go by if I know there's something I can do to help, and right now shutting down a coal mine for a couple of days is something that will help that.
She says it's not her first time doing something like this, though probably the riskiest. The coal mine was chosen because the company Bathurst Resources has filed an application with Environment Canterbury. the regional authority to expand the mine. That decision is being mulled over. Activist Julie Thompson says expansion is the last thing that should be happening.
We're requesting that they withdraw that application and that they start transitioning to a just transition for their workers and our community.
Midway through the morning, the police arrived at the scene, where they cut open the mine gate, which had been padlocked. They arrested 10 of the activists who were actually down at the pit of the mine. Canterbury Rural Area Commander Inspector Peter Cooper says those at the pit were arrested because it was beginning to snow higher up and there were safety concerns as the weather worsened. Police were negotiating with the main cluster of protesters at the entrance, sheltering from the rain under a tarpaulin. The Chief Executive of Bathurst Resources, Richard Taken, says their immediate priority has been for the safety of everyone, whether legally there or not. He says the company supports the transition to a zero-carbon economy, but will do so in a staged way.
We support the government and really the global movement away from fossil fuels, but we'll do it in transition with our customers. That fuel is essential for those industries to be competitive. As our customers transition, we will transition our business as well.
He says the protesters' actions will lead to an increase in CO2 emissions, as coal will have to be transported longer distances to reach Canterbury businesses. The activists say they have supplies which will last them for the next few days, but Mr. Taken says he hopes work on the mine will resume tomorrow. For Checkpoint, ko Elisha Foon tēnei.
Boy, your feedback is flooding in on the prospect of a travel bubble with parts of Australia, some states, and also the yachties. These one cruising the high seas, and some of them would like to come to New Zealand during cyclone season on the yachties. This listener says, let the yachties in. If New Zealand refuses, some of them could be killed in storm season coming up. They can stay on their boats, not taking any isolation spots away from any other returnees. It's important to save lives rather than waste isolation spots on rugby players just so we can entertain the masses. Lynn says, though, those boaties have had 6 months' notice that they needed to find safe harbour. Sandy, though, says let those boats in, charge them a bit, then when they're here, they'll be spending money. Typical Labor government, slow off the mark, get on with it, lives could be at stake. Someone else says that bloke should see if Australia will take the yachties. Well, that bloke, Guy Chester, is an Australian and he is allowed back into Australia. He's just been campaigning on behalf of those that aren't near a home port to go to. This person says, surely the Ocean Cruising Club president realises that if New Zealand lets yachts who haven't properly planned ahead into New Zealand, that the precedent that it sets at practical and political level would be crippling for any country. There are literally thousands of people much more worthy of being let into New Zealand ahead of wealthy yachties acting like they're super privileged citizens of the ocean who should be allowed to do what they want. And this one, wow, pretty much the same vein, really. Stranded boats, no sympathy. Sink, as far as I'm concerned. I should say that's Alan talking, not me. He's not keen on them being here. Roland says if those yachts are left in the Pacific Islands, there will be deaths from cyclones. End of story. Heaps more flooding in. We will try to get to some more of it before we run out of time. A man was physically and sexually abused as a young boy in state care. And he's described his childhood as a nightmare, and the battle to get compensation is a horror movie that will not end. Kerry Johnson, which is a pseudonym, gave evidence today at the Abuse and Care Royal Commission. He spent about 1 year in the Catholic-run St John of God Maryland School in Christchurch before moving into state-run institutions. Now, 48 years old, he's been waiting 16 years for compensation over the abuse he suffered. Our reporter Andrew McRae filed this report and a warning some of it may be distressing to listeners.
Kerry Johnson says he was only 7 when he was taken into care because he says he was an out-of-control kid. He was put into the care of the brothers at St John of God, where 3 of them sexually abused him and others a number of times.
It's hard to say, talk about this, but I just want the world to know that, I was just taken away from my mother and stuck into an environment where they raped me and made me do things to them,
Mr Johnson says there was also physical abuse at Marylands.
They used to beat us up, give us hidings. If we didn't do as they were told.
He was then sent to the state-run Campbell Park Residential School in North Otago, where he spent 6 years. He says it was far worse than Maryland's.
They didn't just rape you and do things to you, they beat the daylights out of you.
Mr Johnson says the physical abuse at Campbell Park included being kicked, punched and beaten with planks of wood.
You know, they just beat you, or sometimes they'll strip you down naked and make you stand out in the cold for hours. And when you come out, you're like cold ass, and they didn't care, they just made you go back to bed.
Kerry Johnson says he still has nightmares about Campbell Park. He says the boys were constantly faced with bullying, threats, violence and screaming.
It's like when you hear them screaming, you know what's going on. You know what's happening to that boy. And then when you hear that scream, it's like he'll come back to his dormitory, into his little cubicle, and us boys just go and sit in there with him because he's crying. And we hold him, we hug him, we just say to him, we know what you're going through, mate, you're fresh meat. That's what they're doing it.
Kerry Johnson spent time at a number of other institutions and foster homes and eventually left care as a teenager, but before long he was in and out of prison, where he is today.
I became a criminal because that's all I known. I didn't know what wrong and right was. I just did what I had to do called survival.
Mr Johnson is still waiting for compensation for the abuse he received at Campbell Park. His claim has been in for 16 years and he describes it as a horror movie that will never end. He wants the government to own up to what happened to him and many other kids in care.
You took us away from our family. You thought it was helping us, taking us away from my parents, but it didn't. It didn't help me. It made me like it made me nightmare. I reckon I would have done better just being with my mum, you know, even if I was a troubled child. My mum had me. She was like my rock.
Kerry Johnson says he hopes to work on a farm once he gets out of prison, because in the city he just gets into trouble. For Checkpoint, call Andrew McRae-Tene.
The federal government's JobKeeper program in Australia has been a lifeline for more than 900,000 businesses that have used it to pay the wages of more than 3.5 million workers. However, from today, JobKeeper starts winding back. The ABC's Stephen Long reports.
At a factory on Sydney's northern beaches, workers are drilling and sanding. But business sure ain't what it used to be.
It's been devastating. Most of our work is gone.
Phil Dyer owns the company, which specialises in making display stands for big trade shows and exhibitions. Until March, when COVID-19 abruptly shut such events, it had more work than it could handle. Now it's dribs and drabs.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, the type of work we're getting, it just can't keep this factory open the way it is.
So you're just hemorrhaging money, you're losing money?
Yes, every day. Every day.
Like more than a third of businesses in Australia, Phil Dyer's company is relying on the government's JobKeeper subsidy to pay wages. From today, JobKeeper for workers employed more than 20 hours a week cuts from $1,500 a fortnight before tax to $1,200. It falls further in January before cutting out altogether in late March. Phil Dyer's worried.
Pretty much everyone here is on JobKeeper. They can't survive on that type of money. You know, they're literally struggling to survive as it is.
The government's betting employers will be able to pay workers without the subsidy as the economy improves. Yet, when the ABS surveyed companies about what will happen when the government stimulus ends, 10% said they would close down. That equates to about 240,000 businesses. Liam Bailey is a company liquidator. From what he's hearing, it could be much worse.
From talking to lawyers, accountants, financial advisors and other people in the industry, I think that figure is entirely conservative, and I think it could be as much as double.
So we're talking then about 500,000 businesses going to the wall?
Entirely possible, yes.
Fear of a spate of company collapses is one reason the government is going to introduce new bankruptcy protections for small businesses to help keep creditors at bay while companies try to restructure. Liam Bailey thinks that could make a difference, but not enough.
I think that it's entirely possible that we are heading towards what's loosely referred to as a depression.
Depression is a strong word.
And it is one that we like to avoid because it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's entirely possible that that is realistically what we're looking at.
He hopes he's proved wrong.
And that was the ABC's Stephen Long with that report. Ooh, lots of feedback coming in on the issue of yachties and whether they should be let into New Zealand during cyclone season, and also on the travel bubble, potentially with Australia. I can tell you now, none of you are sitting on the fence. You're calling it one way or the other, but you don't necessarily agree. This listener says about an Australian travel bubble, yes please, any state that is under control. Another person says only South Island to start with. If the whole country goes and it backfires, we'll all be back to stage one, and that doesn't help anyone. John, categorical, open the borders with Australia now. And another listener says Sydney has proven success with detect, control and suppress. Let's get the bubble going there and prove it works, then on to Queensland in time for the Christmas break. Happy to have Sydney-siders in Queenstown and Christchurch in the same vein, that listener says. Another one says if we open up the one-way bubble to Australia, the only thing it's going to do is hurt our tourism industry, which is going along reasonably because of local spending at the moment. Another listener says, I just heard the interview with the gentleman from Queensland. I do not support the idea of a bubble with community transmission still occurring. We have people here who are not adhering to simple rules, impacting the entire country. I don't wish to have transmission from Australia. Now, switching to the boaties now, this listener says, yep, give them safe harbour. Another person says, surely those yachts have been in COVID isolation for some time. Isn't this a big factor? Bring them here now. Someone else reckons we can bring the yachties in because we need help picking fruit, and it would be an ideal thing for them to do. Another person says those people paying no tax, travelling everywhere, freeloaders.
RNZ News headlines, I'm Catriona McLeod. An investigation is underway after a person fled a managed isolation facility at Auckland's Ramada Federal Street Hotel today by tying sheets together. The latest One News Colmar Brunton poll gives Labour 47% support and National 33%, with ACT on 8% and the Greens on 7%. Dreamworld's owners have been fined almost $4 million over the deaths of 4 people, including New Zealander Cindy Lowe, on a 2016 Gold Coast theme park ride. New figures show Auckland job losses have been far fewer than predicted, despite last month's lockdown. Our next news bulletin is at 7 o'clock.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
Yeah, it's been a sad old day. He was a giant in the New Zealand music industry.
Live with local, national and international